Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in campaigning and community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe. Dunn Street develops community engagement and organising strategies to win campaigns both big and small. We train engagement staff, volunteers and organisers in leadership and power building, and we help leaders craft their own narrative that tells a story that can unite people and move them to act together. And if you want to create change in your community, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. And today's episode is brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn have a Melbourne-based opportunity for an experienced social media and communications professional to support their marketing and employment and industrial relations law teams. If you are highly creative, a technical specialist with strong stakeholder and relationship management skills, then Maurice Blackburn want to hear from you. The campaigns and communication specialist is responsible for executing the social media content plan, largely supporting the employment and industrial law team, but will also have exposure to other areas of the firm. The successful candidate will develop and implement content that will drive traffic and engagement to Maurice Blackburn's practice areas to ensure that the practices remains a leading voice on social media. This is a great job opportunity and will ideally suit an established progressive campaigner looking for a new opportunity in a great professional environment. To find out more about the job or the details and all that kind of stuff, just go to mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. That's mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community both online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, simply go to their website, swiftfoxcrm.com, to win your next campaign. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast. It drops every Friday that dives into the progressive campaigns of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And today we're going to be talking to the National Director for RunFit, which is an independent, non-partisan political organisation working towards better policy outcomes for current and future generations of young people. We're going to be talking to Ed Krutsch, who will talk a bit about the work that RunFit does, and a lot of the issues that are confronting young people. Really interesting bloke doing really interesting work. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like the show, please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast or wherever you get your podcasts. And leave us a review as well, preferably a positive one. And for updates, follow Dunn Street on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. All right, too easy. Let's get to today's episode. We're taping this one on a Tuesday afternoon on the lands of the Gadigal people for a change. And I'm joined on the line from back home. I really stuffed my timing up with this one because I think this bloke actually literally works just around the corner from the Dunn Street studios. But anyway, Ed Krutsch is the National Director for RunFit, which is an independent, non-partisan political organisation working towards a better policy outcomes for current and future generations of young people. No small thing. And he's on the line from Melbourne today to talk to us about some of the great work that they have been doing in this space. Ed, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thanks, Stephen.
Let's before we talk about some of the work that RunFit are doing, and I must admit, I need to put I'll make a commitment to you now that I'll put $5 in the what I'll call the swear jar. If I call you guys run for something, I'll donate $5 to the organisation. So you might make a bit of money out of this podcast. And I'll talk more about why I may do that in a moment. But before we talk about RunFit, tell me a bit about yourself. How did you come to be involved in this kind of work in working for young people?
Yeah, for sure. And not a problem at all about run for something. It happens all the time. But essentially my journey into politics and campaigning started when I was about 15 and became involved with a local youth advisory committee at my council. my family wasn't particularly political, and there wasn't many big issues for me at the time. But somebody I worked with at my part-time job at a dry cleaners at the time told me about how the council had these committees for young people that cared about issues. They could rock up to these meetings and talk to councillors and talk to the council staff about the issues that mattered for them. And it was pretty much from that moment that I was pretty hooked. I could see that this council committee that I was involved with in the city of Port Phillip in Melbourne was having this huge impact on all the youth policies, essentially. Nobody really knew what things young people wanted or what issues were important, but everybody was coming to this committee, and these young people were able to shape different council plans and policies, and also just have a voice to talk about the things that were really mattering to them at that time, and the big things in their life, and like the diversity of issues that young people cared about. And I learned that advocacy is really important, and it's about turning up and just like being in the room and raising your hand and talking about what matters for you to actually start to see that change. And yeah, that committee did some really cool things. We were able to get some better street lighting in the city of Port Phillip for young people after like a whole bunch of young women in the group were talking about not feeling safe walking home from the tram stop at night. We were able to get some tutoring for young people after primary school to go along to the library and have older students supporting them. And I think I could really see that government decision making just like was so important to young people in their lives, but young people just didn't really know, didn't have the ability to have their voice heard. But these kind of mechanisms were just like so important.
When writing these questions for this week's episode, I thought back to my days as a young person, and I mentally still think I'm quite juvenile and young, but certainly my body isn't anymore. And in fact, I had my school reunion just on the weekend, my 30th school reunion, and
Nice.
caught up with a whole bunch of obviously schoolmates that I hadn't seen in 10 years. And they were sort of asking, Stephen, what do you do these days? And I told them I sort of, do what I do. And they said, oh, that makes sense. I kind of thought you would do that. And I just think about young people at, going through high school. I was always, I guess, seen as, the politics nerd that kind of gave a shit about this sort of stuff. But I don't think that's natural, right, for most people to care about that kind of stuff. Why did you care? What did you care about, and why did you care about it at that age? And how old were you roughly when you started? You're 15, you said, didn't you? Yeah. What did you care about, and why did you care about it?
I don't think it is particularly natural. I think a lot of young people are quite disillusioned from what these like politics spaces or what like any form of government, local or federal, is doing. But I think young people really care about justice, and it was at these kind of like first meetings and when I was like exposed to it that I could see that there were some people that were having a much better time than others, and also some that were making the decisions for everybody without some people being able to have a say. I think myself and all the other young people that were involved in this process could really start to see that there was an injustice in that process, that our council was largely older people that were making decisions for us without much consultation, and they didn't necessarily represent all the diversity in our community, and that just felt unjust. I think most young people get that. They don't really get politics, and they might just think you're a bit of a nerd for caring about local government in particular. But I think most young people do have a really strong sense of justice, and they really know what's fair and what's right. And I think that just really hit for me in this process, and being about a 15-year-old, that there was just this injustice in young people not having their voice heard.
Was there something that you saw, though, as a 15-year-old in your own environment, around your community, you was like, that's shit, and I'd like to do something about that if given an opportunity?
I think for me, it was about the wider context of what was happening. I think that like that first discussion that I had when I was in my part-time job was with somebody that I just worked with, and essentially they that was the first organising conversation that I ever had, and they could probably see that there was an interest in me in this justice, and I think we would just start to talk about what was happening in the news and the wider world at that time, and that was about in the Prime Ministership of Scott Morrison, and I think some of his climate policies were not very appealing to many young people at this stage. It was about 2016 or so, or even Malcolm Turnbull era. Without that much awareness of actually what was happening, I think young people were starting to see that, like at this federal level, there were things that like we clearly should be doing and are really important for our environment and for our climate, but our government just isn't doing it. And I think children much younger than 15 were beginning to notice that we had a government that just wasn't really listening to young people and wasn't hearing their voices on those issues. And I think for me, my journey started at local government just because that was the closest, that was the only committee that I could join. That was the level that there was the most grassroots. And from there, I think I learned that all levels of governments make the change, and that young people should be able to have a say at every level of government. But for me, it was only council that really had that opportunity available.
So you had some results that you just mentioned before around tutoring and mentoring for young people and more safety on the streets for young people. You had a taste of it. Where did you go next? What did you want to do next?
Yeah, for sure. I think like once we started to see that young people advocating for what they cared about and the change that they wanted to see was possible, and we could see those results, I was pretty hooked. I think I tried to get involved with every organisation or campaign I could that was led by young people, and just calling out any kind of politician or government that just like wasn't listening to young people. And the big one at the time was climate. I became really, really involved in the climate movement and the like Australian Youth Climate Coalition as a volunteer after school, and even when I was about 18 and I finished school, I became an organiser with them and supported their 2019 election campaign. So over a few years, just built these organising skills as a volunteer with them. And the other one thing that was happening at this same time that I think just really angered me, and it really made me want to just campaign forever and ever, was I was 17 when the marriage equality plebiscite happened, and I really, really wanted to vote. I was just like so aggravated by the fact that 16 and 17-year-olds cared about this issue so much. So many 16 and 17-year-olds were going to be impacted really significantly by the change. And like it was their future that was on the line. And I think from that moment when everyone went to go out and tick their box, yes or no, but I didn't, and it was going to have an impact on my future and the future of all my peers who were under 18 at the time. I was like, I want to keep fighting for governments to hear the voices of young people, and particularly hear them within our democracies and make room within our established institutions to hear the voices of young people, like the opportunity that I had when I was 15 to be involved with that Youth Advisory Council.
There was a moment, I think, not so long ago, although it was pre-COVID, so it probably feels like a decade ago now, but when we really did hear the voices of young people, and that was around the school strike for climate, seeing hundreds of thousands of school students in their uniforms on the streets of all of our major capital cities and across all of our regional centres. And I understand that you had some involvement in that work as well. Just tell us a bit about that moment in time for young people in terms of collectively using their voice to seek change.
Yeah, for sure. I think that was a huge moment for so many young people that rocked up at their first protest, and also a pretty significant protest for many people in that they had to jump over school gates and things like that to get there. But essentially, I'd been volunteering with the Australian Youth Climate Coalition for a few years and started working for them not too long after finishing school. And some young people in Castlemaine started copying the lead of Greta Thunberg and they would go and sit out the front of their MP's office on a Friday afternoon with a couple of placards calling for climate action. And then in Melbourne, some young people started to follow their lead and do it out the front of the Victorian State Parliament. And it just grew and grew and grew until, as an organiser with the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, it pretty quickly became my job to gather all of this energy of school students across Victoria at the time, but it very quickly grew to be nationally and channel it into some really large events. So starting in November 2018, we had one of the biggest school strikes where young people for the first time rocked up, and they were calling out the Scott Morrison government at the time for his lack of action on climate change. And there was a couple of other key demands, some things like stopping the Adani Carmichael coal mine and just not opening new coal and gas. They were things that young people were demanding and turning up on the street and calling for. And I was really lucky to be an organiser for that strike, just doing some of the logistical work that makes these big events happen. And then I did it again in March of 2019 when we had about 100,000 young people rock up on the street and protest for stronger action on climate change.
What's some of the lessons from that work that you and a whole number of other people did across the country, both things that you take away from it and say, okay, we really nailed that, but things where you can look and go, we could have done better, or there's some lessons that we can take with us into the future?
Yeah, for sure. I think one thing that we did really well was telling the stories of young people and talking about the different reasons why young people from a diversity of schools were choosing to leave school early on this day and go to a protest. There was a pretty popular narrative at the time that Scott Morrison even said that we should have less activism in schools and that young people shouldn't be protesting, all that kind of thing. But essentially we were able to, in response to that, communicate that young people did have really real reasons. There were young people who were living at the forefront of climate change, who were beginning to experience these things, or young people who had Pacific backgrounds whose families were going to be displaced by climate change, or young people who had whose family had worked in coal and industries like that for generations, but really didn't see a future for their families and their long-term future as well. And I think we were able to communicate that young people really had so many reasons why they cared about this. It wasn't just because it was to ditch school, or it wasn't just cool to rock up at this protest. There were really genuine reasons why young people saw this great injustice and wanted to kind of collectively take action. One thing that I think a bit of reflection. So that bigger strike in 2019 was a couple of months before the 2019 federal election. And I think one lesson that I had in particular is the ways that we harness the power of young people towards that election wasn't that effective. I think that I ended up campaigning myself a little bit on that election campaign with the Australian Youth Climate Coalition and trying to just harness as much of that kind of youth dissatisfaction with the government at the time into essentially electoral campaigning and trying to get people to change their votes and think about climate and think about younger people as well, and think about the young people that are really active on this issue but not able to get a say or not able to vote. And we put a lot of energy into it, and then the 2019 election saw a pretty devastating result. And I think on reflection, our strategy there probably wasn't that effective. We weren't campaigning in the ways that we should have, and we were probably asking politicians to do things that they were never going to do. And I think from that moment, I've gone on a pretty steep learning journey of looking at how young people can better engage in politics and how we can approach elections and kind of harness this energy of young people that is just so rife, and the amount of issues that young people care about is so significant, and how we can channel those into politics.
My follow-up question is, what were some of those lessons that you took? But I'm wondering if some of those lessons then was the genesis for creating Run for It.
Yeah, definitely. I think like the 2019 federal election has to be a moment in itself that really led to the creation of Run for It. I think that disappointment that I felt in the election result and those kind of strategic learnings about the type of advocacy that we were doing or the type of ways that we were trying to campaign on the election just not being that effective. Like I have a really strong memory of not too long before the 2019 federal election, we met with Josh Frydenberg as the Minister for the Environment at the time. And I think as a group of young people, we saw that our power that we had demonstrated on the streets, there was 150,000 young people, was going to be significant enough to try and change Josh's mind, or that was going to bring us some kind of negotiating power in a room with him, that we could say this is something that young people really care about. But yeah, obviously it meant nothing. Like
it got you in the room, though. I think 150,000 people got you in the room, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we were able to make a big enough scene, and we were able to find that space. Yeah, I think we probably had that meeting. I just don't think we could quite compete with, say, the minerals lobby or the coal and gas industries that were funding Josh Frydenberg and his campaigns at the time. I think maybe we thought that we could have that fight, but we couldn't.
So, talk to us about Run for It. What's the problem or problems you seek to solve with the creation of this organisation?
Yeah, for sure. So I think after these like events of the 2019 federal election and acknowledging that young people's political power was pretty impotent in Australia, I sought out to look at how we could best engage young people in our democracy and make meaningful change that gives young people a seat at the decision-making table and has a stronger mechanism than us just having to kind of go out and protest every week when there's an issue that lots and lots of young people care about. So I started to look at some of the movements overseas, like Run for Something, which we mentioned earlier. That's a really good example that directly supports progressive candidates to run for election. And it's a capacity builder that gets behind young people who are putting their hand up. I think it's a slightly older number with Run for Something, but they're still generally young progressives of some kind, and gets behind their campaigns for election that are usually against like an establishment type of candidate. So I started to research those kind of models, looking at the ways that we could just like get more young people voting and turning up at the ballot box. But when there was a local government election in Queensland, and essentially I became really interested in that campaign and the experience of the young people that were running. And I got in contact whilst they were running their campaigns about like what motivated you to run for local government and what their campaigns looked like. And from their experiences, I was able to kind of form the opinion that local government is a really good place to start. And obviously I had that predisposition from my experience engaging with local government as a 15-year-old. And I thought young people need to start running in elections. That's probably how we're going to build the political power of young people. Even if they don't all get elected, we're going to start a discussion about what the role of young people is in politics, and that it's kind of not just like an old boys club. It can be for new and fresh ideas. And essentially we were able to look at some of the challenges that young people face in being a candidate and start resourcing them. And in doing that, I think our vision expanded, and we saw that generally across all kinds of issues and movements that young people are involved in, there is a poor relationship with democracy and elections. And we created an organisation that's Run for It that has a vision to essentially fix politics for young people. And that means that we're looking at the all the things that we can do to elect more young people, mainly at local level, but also engage more young people as volunteers on election campaigns, how we can get them out doing things like phone blanks and door knocking, and how we can also get more young people just turning up at the ballot box and more young people enfranchised to vote as well.
So, for context for our listeners to the podcast, Run for Something was started by Amanda Littman and Ross Morales-Ricchetto, and we've had Ross on the podcast a number of times, and is a good friend of Dunn Street's because our US delegation, we take over in September. We sit down with Ross and hear the good work that those guys are doing. And Ross would, and if you go back and listen to some of the episodes with Ross, the genesis of their work was that after the 2016 US presidential election, and feeling so dejected about the Trump presidency, they looked at the lack of competitive races in down ballot elections. And by that, I don't mean, House of Representatives in the Congress or the Senate, and I don't even mean state houses. I'm talking local governments, school boards, dog catchers, treasurers. There's so many elections in the United States. I love them. It's an industry, right? And what they were trying to do was actually, and they talk about they're trying to fill the bench, like they're trying to build a bench for progressives to then later on go on and run for some of those government positions in higher office. And what they found was that there was in a lot of situations across a lot of states outside of the bigger, California or New York or Texas, there were races where people were Republicans were getting elected unopposed. There just wasn't anyone standing. And in the early days, in those midterms in 2018, they were able just to support candidates, just to stand and run a competitive race. So there was this big problem because there was a lack of democracy in the United States. With that context for our listeners, but putting it back to you, Ed, what's the problem going on in our democracy? How did you view that? It wasn't because we don't have as big a democracy, right? We've got state, federal, and local government, and that's kind of it. Like, you intentionally targeted, I'm assuming, local government. Did you see a gap in the market, so to speak, in which it was an easy way to go in there and organise? Or what are you trying to achieve here?
Yeah, I think there's a few different things there. So really similar to Run for Something, but I think the motivations from me and the other young people that we involved in setting up Run for It in Australia, essentially we had all these policy concerns. We came from a place of being like, we're young people who care about climate, we're young people who care about equality, we're young people who care about workers' rights, all these different issues, but there's really nobody listening to us. There's nobody that represents us in our parliaments, in our local councils. There's this real lack of representation and essentially a political class that's been developed because our politics just hasn't been appealing to young people for a really long time. We have much older parliaments than we do a society. The numbers are pretty kooky when we look at them.
Has it got worse over time? I don't know. I'll put you on the spot there, but has it actually, in terms of those? Because I feel like our parliaments are getting more diverse and us getting closer to looking like our constituency. They're not nailing it, obviously, but it is getting better. But in terms of youth representation, is it getting better or worse?
Yeah, no, our parliaments are definitely getting more diverse, and our parliaments have never represented young people that well. In previous parliaments, when life expectancies and things like that have been a little bit lower, we've had higher proportions of young people, but those parliaments have been far from diverse as well. They've usually consisted of maybe, if a bit younger, privileged white men. But the problem at local council is still really, really significant. There's a lot of communities where the kind of common narrative is that your local council is made up of maybe a retired real estate agent, a retired school principal, and a retired police officer, and that's what a council looks like. Whereas there are so many communities that have huge populations of young people that have like really real policy concerns. They have really real things going on in their life and things that council can do as well. Things like childcare and just like local community facilities, parks and pools, and the things that people often need most. And they care about these things, but they don't have a council that understands their need for these services or understands what their life and lived experience is. I think the most shocking number I learned is that only across Queensland, Victoria, and New South Wales, only 12% of local government areas have one person aged under 35 on them. It's just really common that councils don't have a younger person on them, and our parliaments are the same. I think in the last federal parliament, there was maybe one or two people aged under 35, but there was 8 people with the first name Andrew.
Well, the Andrew lobby is very, very, very influential. With they're bigger than big tobacco.
Obviously, unsuccessful.
Who knew? So you've set up this organisation, and it's geared towards getting young people to run for local government. When you're setting up such an organisation, as I said at the start, you're non-partisan. But are you going to support any young person that puts their hand up? Like, is there a criteria for a young person depending on their politics or their values? How do you? I asked the same question of Ross when he was on the show. Like, how do you work out who you're going to throw your resources behind and give that support to?
Yeah, for sure. It's a good question. We do only support a particular kind of candidate. Essentially, when we first started running these campaigns, and I had learned of like what some of the challenges to young people running is, and what the challenges to young people voting are, and how we can start to repair those so that young people can have their voices heard and have someone that looks like them on their council. We ran a test campaign in Victoria, and we started to do all this thinking with like young people that were active and engaged about what a local government campaign could look like run by an organisation such as Run For It. And we developed essentially a values form. So we asked that all the candidates that we were going to support align to these values. And we did this well before we started thinking about how many candidates we'd be supporting or where we'd be supporting them. But we started to think, what are the big issues to young people, and how can we communicate them in a way that is flexible enough to people all over the state that they're the values of young people, but they're not going to be things that are super, like, especially when you talk about something like climate change. It can just have, I think everybody can understand the core injustices in that issue, but the language and the ways that we talk about it might be really different in Mildura and the Latrobe Valley to the way we do in Brunswick and St Kilda and the inner cities and places like that. So essentially we created this document that made sure that all candidates could let us know that they aligned with our values, that they didn't believe in racism, they did believe in climate change, they did see a vision for an equitable society. And what that meant is that when we kind of went and ran this campaign with these values and only supporting candidates with these values, we didn't see many or any candidates from the Conservative side, and all the young people that we ended up supported they were most significantly independents, but then there was young candidates endorsed by the ALP, young candidates endorsed by the Greens, the Animal Justice Party, the Socialists, all these different organisations that aligned to our values and represented different constituencies in their local areas that we ended up supporting to different degrees. And we essentially ran a campaign that got quite a few of them elected across Victoria that first round. I think we ended up supporting 75 candidates in total, and 25, so about a third got elected. And
that's huge.
Yeah, since being elected, they've been amazing as well. We have young people that have got elected onto councils that, before they were elected, the youngest councillor they'd ever had was 50. And then there's a young person in this like regional or rural place that's able to talk to what living in that area as a regional or young person is like.
Let's take a quick break to talk about SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up to date, absolutely. Phone banks that can change minds. Emails that drive donations, and events that will energize the community online and offline. And text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Okay, let's get back to the show.
I just also feel a level of sympathy for that person, because I think any issue related to anything remotely young, they've got to get the question, well, what do you think we should do? Like, it'll be a question about someone who's like, an issue that's related to someone who's in their 30s. Well, I don't know, I'm bloody 19. Why are you asking me? You've watched Seinfeld. What do you think we should do? Right. Okay. That's fantastic. So how did you work out what you needed to do to provide support to these candidates? How did you strategize about where you can provide support?
Yeah, for sure. So I think one thing that we knew is that we needed to get more young people running. Like, obviously, politics and a council of all people over 50 or over 60 doesn't really look appealing to be that one person that everybody comes to. But we knew that was our long-term goal. We needed to start finding more young people and supporting them. But one of the most powerful things that we could do is just like get all those young people onto the councils, and they can become these representatives, these advocates that really demonstrate that politics can be different. A bit of a side note, but a backdrop to this that was inspiring so many people at this time was the election of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I think so many young people saw that in the US, and they're like, oh, well, politics can be different. And particularly they saw the Knock Down the House documentary, and there was this energy for engaging in democracy and running these kind of campaigns where you presented politics as something that looked a bit different. But we started to talk to the young people about what they actually needed. I had a bit of understanding from doing a bit of research around those Queensland local government elections, and essentially a lot of it is just about a lot of it's fundraising. Like, young people often don't have the money that established older candidates do. They don't have the nest egg that the 60-year-old candidates might be sitting on that allow them to run for council time and time after. They often just don't have like the network around them, particularly if they're in a regional area or somewhere suburban where there aren't young people on council. Their MPs aren't young and aren't supportive of them. They don't feel like there's other young people who they can go out to, who they can talk to. And then there's all the things that a good campaign needs, like a bit of a field game and all that voter contact, and generally to be organising within their communities. So we essentially started to build training and kind of support programs that provide these young people who are putting their hands up with this kind of wraparound campaign support and just this massive capacity boost that really aims to just like leverage the playing field with older established candidates that have run multiple times. So we'd help them run little fundraising drives, whether that was just like making t-shirts and selling them or setting up GoFundMe pages, just really small scale fundraising for their campaign so they could pay their nomination fees to the VEC and things like that. We built like digital ways where young people could just come together on like a Friday evening who are all young candidates and just talk about what their week on the campaign trail had been like, and share any learnings. We kind of made templates and things that they could go and use. So they, like, every time they made a social media post, there was a bit of an idea there, and we kind of got experts in the room who could guide them on how to get really strong voter contact strategies up, and how they could have the most compelling and persuasive conversations with their voters. We did, unfortunately, do a lot of this under the cloud of the first lockdown in 2020, which hampered all the things that we wanted to do, the big door knocks and phone banks and things like that. But we still gave it a pretty good shot, and I think a lot of young people were also able to talk about the narrative of COVID when having these persuasive conversations and in their election campaigns, and saying, like, we really can see the impact of government in our lives now, and we can see that young people do really rely on these services. It's really important for these all levels of government to be delivering effective services and to be supporting people and making good policy decisions to have someone who's under 35 at the table and having their voice heard.
Talk to me about your recruitment strategy. What types of young people are drawn to wanting to stand for public office? Are you seeking them out, or is it? I'm just interested about how you're going about finding those people, or are they finding you?
Yeah, and that's been a lot of the work we've been able to invest in since this first Victorian campaign in 2020. And as unfortunate as it is, to answer your question bluntly, the type of young people that are drawn to running are often not the best person to be elected or to be a candidate. I think like a lot of hacks see an opportunity to kind of, they see an opening, and often they don't represent the parts of the community that are most underrepresented. So what we've tried to do is build relationships with organisations that do kind of grassroots work in communities and groups of young people that might not be like form a formal association or anything, but they're just young people that care about issues, doing work in their communities, and working with those groups of young people to kind of build their interest in engaging with politics and democracy and government at all levels, and then also give them the skills to run if they wanted to. So we run a whole bunch of different workshops for groups that might not have ever thought about running before, but we hope to kind of plant that seed. And we've done some really interesting work with like groups of young African people in Melbourne's West, who obviously are a significant portion of the population, but don't have much formal representation, and like some even have kind of like troubling relationships with government, and they you talk about like wanting to engage in that thing, and young people just turn off because of their own negative experiences or something like that. But when you're able to really talk about how you can make change at these levels, and how they can make a representation for those future generations of young people living in their area and in their community, then we've been able to work with a whole bunch of young people to put their hands up eventually across New South Wales, South Australia and Tasmania, and run for council. I think it's probably the area, or it's one of the areas that we have the most work still to be done on. I think that initial candidate pipeline, like there are young people that will run, but finding the young people that we need most to be representing their peers and the young people that have the strongest stories to tell, there's probably a bit more work to be done in getting them into that pipeline to candidacy.
It's a really interesting point you raised there, Ed, because standing for public office is no small thing. You know, you're, apart from the fact it's hard work, you are seeking public office. You are now a public identity. Whether you win or not, your name's going to be on a ballot paper that thousands of people are going to see. Your photo is going to be all over the place, social media and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of things come with that, right? So even just deciding to do that is a big daunting task. And if I was, between the ages of 18 and I don't know what sort of, what your target audience is, but a young person to make that decision, that's a huge thing. And the second thing is, I just wonder about how do you as an organisation go seeking out people that, like, do you want them to decide or understand or come to the conclusion that running for public office is a strategic goal that can lead to change? Because for me personally, I don't ever want to run for public office. That would be the last thing that I'd ever want to do. I think that I can create change in other ways than, seeking pre-selection for the Australian Labor Party and then, getting a seat in Parliament. I don't want to do that. I have the greatest of respect for the people that do want to do that. But I'm also well aware of the fact that there are people that stand for public office that have not sat down and actually worked out why the fuck they want to do this in the first place, and they're literally just taking up a bum on a seat because of it's a cultural norm within a political organisation. That's the next step that I need to do. I knew full well that when I was a party official that this would be it for me in terms of within the party structure. I wasn't going to pursue a career in politics. I don't know why I'm sharing this with you, but anyway, I've never said this publicly. But there you go. You know what I mean? Like, I've made a mental decision to say, well, that's all I can give. I have to work out how else I want to make a contribution to this movement, and now I'm doing it through community organising. There are a lot young feet, and I'm 47. How old? 48, 47. It's taken me that long to work that out, right? There's no way I would have been able to know that at 18 or 19. I still couldn't work out what subjects I wanted to do at La Trobe University, for Christ's sake, let alone what kind of contribution. So how do you work with young people to say to them, like, without pressuring them in to say, no, you should run, but also understanding this is how you can create change, but this is the responsibility that comes with it, right? It's a big thing you're putting on people.
Yeah, it's really huge, and it's a hard thing to be working with as well. And like it's particularly hard when you face people that it's easy to ask someone like who you think should run and tell them all the responsibilities of running, and it's also really hard to speak to someone that you don't think should be running, and tend to not have these conversations that often, but quite often I want to, and tell people that they're maybe not the right type of candidate. But there's a couple of different things that we have to do, and one of them is just like in the support that we provide, we do transparently identify candidates that might be more historically underrepresented or have a greater need for our support and our backing, and we just essentially have to distribute the amount of resources and support that we have in a way that's fair to the people that need the most support. And we, in terms of those values, we want young people that we support to align to the values and then also align to what a good representative looks like. And more often than not, the people that we've worked with have been young community leaders that are really passionate about the issues. They're really passionate about the place that they live, and they're really passionate about the people that live in that area. And they would be really good representatives for their community, but they just don't see politics as a mechanism for change, and they believe their work on the ground is powerful, but we just do really need their voices at the decision-making table as well to see that change. We don't need everybody doing that, but there are some young people who are just doing such great work that their presence in local councils and hopefully one day in state and federal parliaments would be totally invaluable. And I think the other piece of work that we do that is more when there's a wider community of young people that are wanting to engage with politics and democracy, is just talking about the work that needs to be done to back a candidate in. And that's why we support campaign teams and organisers and campaign managers who are like almost always volunteers to back in their peers, and why we want to build that movement of young people that supports young people. That's pretty huge when we run campaigns, that we need young people with a big community of usually young people getting behind them. And most groups of young people know who their leaders in their communities are and who the young people that are doing that work and really represent them best are. And hopefully that reflects the ballot box. So we do the work across the candidates, we do the work across the volunteers, and then we do a bit of work across engaging more young people as voters as well, making sure that young people are turning out and supporting young people and understanding that there's a great young person who's running for council in their area to represent them, and they can vote for them.
I'm interested in looking at it through the lens of organising and capacity building. You will know that the three elements of an organising program that needs to be, for it to be successful: one, it has to develop the individual learning of people involved; two, it has to grow the capacity; and three, it obviously has to achieve a strategic goal or get you closer to that strategic goal. Can I ask about, obviously, the individual learning you've talked about, because you are developing people's skills in running for office or getting involved in campaigns. The capacity building, thinking back from the very first time you began this program to where you are now, has the pipeline of people wanting to get involved in this work grown? And if so, how?
I would say so. I think that we're seeing greater engagement from communities that wouldn't have previously wanted to engage, and through building our network as an organisation in the places that we see the most representation needed, we've been able to grow that presence and also build the capacity of that wider network. I think more young people are beginning to put their hands up, and I think next year we have local government elections in both Victoria and New South Wales and Queensland, actually. And I think young people will continue to put their hands up and run, but I don't think it's quite meeting the need. Like, I think that 12%, even just to double that, we only would have a quarter of councils across the East Coast having a person under 35 on them. We need a lot more young people, and a lot more young people in particular geographies as well, putting their hand up and representing their wider communities of young people within those areas.
How do you target? Like, I mean, you said you've got 3 local government elections coming up next year in 3 east, or basically the Eastern Seaboard states. How do you work out where you're going to allocate your resources to support folks? Like, is it very city centric, or are you out in the outer suburbs? Are you in the bush? Like, these are big, municipalities. How have you worked out where you're going to focus your time and energy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Firstly, next year's going to be huge, but we'll hopefully be able to get there. It's, for us, like, we just can't work everywhere. It's based on a few different things. We tend to get drawn to these eastern states that the elections happen to be in, just by virtue of our teams being mostly located there and bigger populations of young people. And then what we look for is areas that have, like a high population of people, say, under 35, but no existing representation. Above that, like, really real issues for young people in those communities. So places where there are things that in the future, young people's voices are going to be so valuable and so critical on, but there just hasn't been this history of listening to young people, and the impact of a young person on that council in terms of the policy making will be really huge, and then also on just like giving that population of young people a representation. But in short, there's a lot more places that need our campaigns and need young people on councils than we have the resources to properly resource. But we'll give it a crack to do as many as we can.
You spoke about the motivation that came from watching AOC win a primary against fellow Democratic incumbent in her district in New York. The interesting thing about that is that I guess the conditions upon which she could win was that she registered a whole bunch of voters that hadn't voted before in a Democratic primary against an incumbent that didn't take her seriously and spent more time in Washington, D.C. than actually looking after his own district. I'm wondering, what it's done is it's now held to account incumbent Democratic Congress people to not take their local communities for granted. Is there a view within Run For It? I'm trying so hard not to say run for something. I'm so proud of myself so far, but I'm not. It means I'm not kicking money into your campaign. Is there a view amongst your folks about actually sticking your nose into internal pre-selections within, say, the Greens or the Labor Party or the Trots or Socialists, whatever they're called? Is there an interest there to start to actually say to, hey, some young people, you should put your hand up, and if you want to put your hand up, we'll help you. Like, do you want to start meddling in internal party affairs, or are you going to keep it to just what you're doing at the moment, which is local government?
Yeah, it's not really on the horizon for us as an organisation. I think not because there's an ideological opposition to that. I think we've just found the piece of work, and essentially it's one of those things that once you have young people, like young people do run in political parties as well as independents with our support, once you do have a young person who's a member of a political party who's been able to demonstrate that they've been able to win a pre-selection, get onto a local council and represent that community, the work that they do is really valuable, usually within their own political party. And just like the role of a couple of really good young people demonstrating like a different kind of representative is really powerful. And like, I think all political parties have a bit of a generational issue, and there's a need for new energy. And I think like we see our mechanism for changing political parties is just by running these strong campaigns that elect young people who kind of build our movement and build our network of young elected people or young organisers and campaigners who back in young candidates.
I feel like just I'm throwing all these different scenarios that would go through my head about if I was working for you guys. Like if you had a young Green candidate and a young Labor candidate standing in the same ward, do you support both of them? Like how do you manage that if that was to happen?
Yeah, it's a challenge. We support more than one candidate in the same ward, and that has happened on a couple of occasions.
Oh, okay, right.
Essentially, with that tiered support that we provide to different candidates, it tends to be independents that don't have the support of the party that do get more support than party candidates, just because our support looks a little bit like what a political party might provide, but it's just that extra boost for a young person. So it tends to be that essentially in a ward where there's two young people running, we just want more young people on that council, and we know that'll be valuable. It doesn't really matter too much what their political affiliation is to us, but we think that's great that young people get to be able to have that option of two people who represent them demographically, but then they also get to make the decision based on a few policies and extra things like that. But it's unlikely that those two young people are going to get that much support from us running against each other, but they'll both be members of our network. They'll get access to the resources that we create, but we're probably not going to be giving them the one-on-one support that an independent running in the country from an underrepresented background might be getting.
I imagine that the cost would vary from city to city, region to region, suburb to suburb. But broadly speaking, if you're a young person, you want to stand for local government, what kind of budget are you looking at in order to make a bit of a dent in a campaign?
Yeah, we probably see about an average spend of $10,000. That's pretty decent. You can do it for a lot less. And if you have more money, you can do it for a bit more. The benefits of being in political parties is that sometimes things are done for you and they're done for everybody at the same time, which means that you don't have to go and do that individual expense. But yeah, about $10,000 is a good amount for a candidate to spend. But the issue with that is that most people under 35 don't have $10,000 just sitting in the bank waiting for an election campaign.
And just to wrap up, you mentioned before, obviously, you've got 3 big local government elections coming up in 2024, which isn't that far away. Have you, as an organisation, worked out what your strategic goal is numerically, or something to measure your success? I'm interested in getting a sense about what your focus will look like going into these campaigns next year.
Yeah, I think I touched on it before in terms of how dire it is at the moment. We would like to hit that number that looks like a doubling of the amount of young people on local councils across those East Coast. So from about 12.5 to 25% of councils having at least one person under 35 on them.
Fantastic. And if you are a young person listening to this show and you want to get involved, either are interested in standing for local government or interested in participating in the campaigns you guys are running, what's the best way to get in touch with Run For It?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of resources on our website. So that's Run For It, numeral for it.org. You can come along to some of the trainings or the events that we run. There's petitions you can sign for some of the other campaigns. We have one that we're supporting at the moment to lower the voting age. And you can also sign up as a candidate. You can also nominate a mate, which is if you know somebody who might be a really good candidate, put them onto this list, and then we'll take a look at them and maybe give them a call and come and run a workshop for them or something like that.
Fantastic. We'll put the links in the description for this week's episode as well for people to click on if they want to find out more information. Ed, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's been super insightful. You're doing great work. Super jealous. I'm glad someone's picked up the mantle of what Ross and Amanda did in the US, because I was always impressed with what Run For Something did. So I'm glad to see this is happening in Australia, and I'm glad to see it's happening for the good guys as well. So strength to your arm. Keep up the good work, and good luck with the elections next year.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Stephen.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Socially Democratic was brought to you by Morris Blackburn Lawyers. Morris Blackburn Lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians. They've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means you'll get the best results possible. Find out more on their website, morrisblackburn.com.au. Morris Blackburn, experience you can count on. Socially Democratic was brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. To find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign.